India's security doctrine is asserting its strength. Let's shift to a different axis. India and its former colonial ruler, the UK. With the India-UK FTA on the table, how's the relationship evolving beyond its history? From cricket pitches to strategic partnerships, how are London and New Delhi navigating a multipolar world? Let's look beyond the Raj in India-UK relations. Please welcome General Sir Nick Carter, GCB CBDSO ADC General, former Chief of the Defence Staff, UK, in conversation with both the Satwa Ganguly and Nalin Mehta for a session on Old Friends, New Foundations.
Thank you very much. General Carter, a warm welcome to you for the Rising Bharat Summit. Thanks for coming down all the way to Delhi for this. It's a good day to have a British general on the panel. We are entering a new age, as it were, in the Middle East. With Trump as you know, General, as you're talking just off stage, has announced that regime change in Iran is the objective. We've had attacks, retaliatory attacks by Iran at a series of targets of American bases in the region, in Qatar, in UAE, on the US Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. They've mostly been shot down. But we are seeing an escalation. So, sir, is regime change possible? As a military professional who served in the region, you oversaw the withdrawal of British forces in Afghanistan. You served in various bases across there, including in Cyprus. So how are you looking at this from a military point of view?
Well, I think regime change is always a phenomenally difficult objective to achieve. And I think in this particular set of circumstances, I'm no expert on Iran, but when you look at the way the regime is constructed, it's much more about a web of power rather than a sort of hierarchy like we see in this country or my own country. So I think that it may be all well and good taking out the leadership, but of course there's then the IRGC, and there are a whole manner of other systems in place to make sure that the regime can survive and the revolution can endure. So I think unless there is a genuinely popular uprising where people overcome the potential fear that the regime uses to remain in power as well, I think it will be phenomenally difficult to see it happen. Now, some of the military objectives I think may well be achievable. The idea of writing down Iran's ballistic missile program, I'm sure, is achievable up to a point. It's interesting that despite the obliteration last June of the nuclear program, we're going back for more, so there must be something to be done there. And then, of course, there's the question of Iran's proxies, and we've not yet seen attacks by the proxies on US bases in the region, but my guess is that US bases in Iraq will be on a very high alert at the moment, and I suspect something will happen in northern Syria as well. I think the question, of course, is, does this lead to a much wider regional conflagration? And that, of course, is what this country and my country are looking in on at the moment with some concern.
So just to ask a follow-up question, would it be fair to say that the odds are, from a military point of view, military capability point of view, that the odds are stacked against Iran and that it is, in that sense, it's asymmetric?
Yes, certainly, but Iran also has, with her asymmetric capabilities, the ability to fight back. And I think if Iran can broaden the conflict, that's not going to be popular in the Gulf states, I would guess. It's not going to be popular in the international community. And of course, as we well know, 25% of the world's oil passages through the Straits of Hormuz. And as Iran demonstrated last week, they still have the capabilities to be able to certainly interdict the passage of oil and perhaps close the Straits of Hormuz. So they've got other levers, and they've also got the ability to use terrorist tactics further afield. So, beware of what you bring on, I think, always on these occasions.
So let me ask you one more thing. So you mentioned the Straits of Hormuz. Now, for this country in particular, 50% of our oil supplies come through the Straits of Hormuz. A significant part of global oil supplies go through the Straits of Hormuz. Most of Iranian oil supplies, of course, go to China, which is about 3% of the energy supplies. Now, from what militarily, because we saw last year also in June when the strikes happened. What's different from then to now, and what's the capability the Iranians have in your view? I mean, you mentioned the exercise they did last week to demonstrate the capability to sort of interdict the Gulf of Hormuz or the Straits of Hormuz, but how real is that capability from your point of view?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting to sort of reflect on the fact that up until last week, the oil price is as low as many of us can remember. And indeed, of course, one of the reasons that it was so loyal is because there was so much supply. But also, I think, because a lot of people have been stockpiling oil, not least the Chinese. So I think that we're probably in a slightly different set of circumstances in the short term to what perhaps the pessimists might believe. Now, if the Straits of Hormuz end up being interdicted and therefore effectively closed for a long period of time, that will have a major impact upon India's position and the global economy more broadly. But my guess is it's not going to be a long-term problem. It'll be a short-term problem. I think we will see the price of oil go up markedly tomorrow when markets open.
It's been somewhere around 70 to $72 a barrel last few weeks. A lot of people are saying it could go up to as much as $80 a barrel pretty soon. Is that something that, what's your view?
That would be, I mean, I'm not suggesting anybody gets into insider trading just yet, but my guess is it's going to go above $70 when the markets open tomorrow morning, for sure.
So if I may ask you, if you go back to some of the wars of the Cold War, so let's say the Arab-Israeli wars, the US, America would back Israel, and let's say Egypt would be backed by the Soviet Union, including considerable supplies of weaponry. Now, do you see in this current conflict, do you see China or Russia helping Iran in any significant way? And B, I just also wanted to bring in this Venezuela operation where, Maduro was taken out, and so far, from what it appears that Iranian air defense has not been particularly effective in countering the airstrikes. So what does that speak about the capabilities of a Russian supplied or a air defense system?
Yes, I mean, I think what was very obvious in June last year was that Russia wasn't able and didn't seem inclined to help Iran militarily. And I think what was also obvious was that it appeared relatively straightforward for the Israeli Air Force to take down the Russian supplied air defense system. Now, I don't think it was the most modern of Russia's capabilities. I think there are more modern capabilities available, not least what's called the S-400. But I think it does beg questions about the resilience of Russian and, to a degree, Chinese air defense systems if a combination of cyber and kinetic attacks can degrade them to the extent to which they've been degraded. And my guess, we haven't heard of it yet, is that there's a degree of confidence in these latest American and Israeli attacks over Iranian airspace that the air defense system has been so degraded that they can attack with impunity. So I think it does beg questions about the challenge in the air defense world. And it does beg challenge about what modern missiles in particular can do to be able to get past and around air defense systems.
So, General, you made a fascinating point outside when we were talking, and with your permission, if I may push you on that. You made the point that since the Second World War, the West, broadly speaking, has only really won two wars. The Falklands War, which the British Army, of course, won, and the Saddam Hussein war.
More the British Navy, actually.
Of course. And the war against Saddam Hussein. And you made the point about military objectives and clarity and so on that. So let me ask you on this, because we are now entering a new configuration with Iran on a scale which seems much higher than what happened a few months back. It's been the objective of Hawks in America since 1979 for regime change in Iran. We now have a declared aim of regime change. Can the Americans win this war?
Well, I mean, the word win, of course, is a provocative word because it implies defeat and victory and so on and so forth, and it implies the achievement of the objective. And I think, we listened to Donald Trump's 8-minute speech this morning, and it's quite clear in that speech that regime change enabled by the Iranian population is what, of course, he's striving to achieve. Well, in my own personal opinion, that's not going to happen overnight. I think it's an extremely difficult objective to realize. And to the point I made to you outside the room, if you do look back over history, it's very important always that the political objectives lead to achievable military objectives. And whether you're studying the campaigns in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the list is endless. you will pretty quickly determine that the political objectives didn't match the military objectives. And the upshot of all of that was that there was no victory. So it's really important, I think, that in that dialogue between policymakers and senior military figures, that the correct objectives are identified at the beginning of a campaign.
So what do you think the Americans are trying here, sir?
Sorry?
So what do you think the Americans are trying here at the moment? What's the best case scenario?
What are the Americans trying to do?
Well, I think we haven't got much to go on. We've heard what Donald Trump said this morning. But I think most people looking in on this will be questioning the extent to which regime change, if that's the objective, is feasible. And I suspect that the reason some people have been resigned early from positions close to the military advisors may well be an indication that there are other people who are concerned as to whether or not this will happen. But, we saw the pressure that he placed on Venezuela. We saw the removal of President Maduro. And I suspect he believed that that was a victory. And that that's going in the direction he wants it to go in. So it may well be that he fundamentally believes this is achievable and deliverable. And I guess that we all have to give people the benefit of the doubt for a while.
So do you think, in fact, I just want to take you up on that point. Do you think that they could follow the Venezuelan model where obviously Maduro's successor does appear to be cooperating with the US in a very significant manner? In fact, it's been said that they're even negotiating with the Cuban leadership. So do you think a part of the Iranian leadership could possibly cooperate or come in line with an American vision of the world after a 7-day or a 10-day campaign? Do you think that's the game here?
Personally, no. I think they are two completely different scenarios. And of course, there were insiders, I think, around Maduro who eventually sold him down the river, which is why the operation was so successful. I think that's most unlikely to be the case in the Iranian set of circumstances.
General, you talked earlier about Iranian proxies, and for a long time militarily, that's been a big strategic bet the Iranians have made to have proxies everywhere from Hamas to right across to Syria and to Yemen. Those have been degraded over the last year significantly, but they remain strong in pockets. So what's your sense about the Iranian counter-response, if you like? What form or shape would that take beyond the immediate salvos we've seen today?
Well, one of the problems you have if you declare regime change as your objective is that makes the war an existential problem for the regime that you've declared you want to remove. And that therefore means that I suspect for them it is a total war. And that means I suspect we will see Lebanese Hezbollah being mobilized to go on the offensive with Israel. I suspect we may well see Hamas being encouraged perhaps to go on the offensive in Gaza again. And I'm sure we'll see the Houthis being encouraged to close the Bab al-Mandab and the bottom end of the Red Sea. Because these are existential issues as far as the Iranian government is now concerned. Which is why I think managing this in a way that it remains very focused and very constrained could be challenging. If you hadn't declared regime change, then perhaps Iran would have responded differently. We saw back in June where that was not a declaration of intent, that Iran simply gestured with one attack on an American base in Qatar. This time it's going to be different, would be my guess.
Do you see boots on the ground, American boots on the ground?
I would be amazed if an American president, who's made it very clear twice, at least in election campaigns, that he'd want to be involved in forever wars, wanting to put American boots on the ground. Doesn't mean that might not be the odd special forces operation, perhaps, but I would be amazed if there was anything more than that. I think it would be very difficult for him politically to do that.
I want to ask you about the Trump doctrine, as it were. This is a president who came to power specifically among the key issues that he talked about was a retreat from universalism, return to American isolationism, talking about a much more 19th century view of the world. Specifically, he railed against American military interventions over the last 2 or 3 presidencies. But in the last few months, we've seen military action by the Americans in Yemen, in Nigeria, in Syria, in Venezuela, which both he talked about. There's been conversations around the Pacific and the Caribbean, conversations around Colombia, Mexico, and of course around Denmark and Greenland. Now you're seeing a serious escalation in Iran. It's really impossible to have regime change without boots on the ground, as you said. So what does this say about this change in Trump's doctrine, if there is a Trump doctrine, or do you think he's turning it on its head?
No, I mean, I think there is a theme to his foreign and security policy. And of course, we saw that published in December when the US National Security Strategy was published, and we saw that reinforced by the US National Defense Strategy that was published at the beginning of January. And essentially, that is a doctrine that is focused on the Western Hemisphere, and therefore it's on the Americas. And that's why Greenland is significant, because he would see that in geographic terms as being part of the Western Hemisphere. And it's why the Caribbean matters. It's why he's done a deal with Argentina. So I wouldn't describe him as isolationist. I would describe him as the Western Hemisphere first and foremost. Then I think it's interesting to speculate on what happens next, because the doctrine would suggest that actually the challenge of China is something that needs to be counteracted. And that, of course, means that you are drawn from the Western Hemisphere into being more globally oriented. But the priority is still the Western Hemisphere and keeping China out of the Western Hemisphere to all intents and purposes. Anyway, he's described this as what he calls the Dunroe Doctrine, which is his take on the original Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century. And of course, that's led to a rupture in his relationship with Europe. And I think one of the most important conclusions that this audience could draw from the way the world has changed is there is this division between Europe and the United States in terms of how we see security and indeed resilience looking forwards. And that's why, of course, I think he was exactly right to call Europe out and say, you've got to defend yourselves now. You know, it's no good for the US to continue to bankroll you any longer. You've got to step up to the plate, which I'm sure was absolutely right. But it has led, I think, to many European leaders believing there is now no longer going to be that strength of relationship across the Atlantic in the way that perhaps we've all had as a luxury over the last 80 years.
I just want to take off, coming on one aspect that you raised on I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but one aspect that you said on China. Do you think that at some stage, Xi Jinping sometime, I mean, various dates have been tossed about like 2027 or end of the decade, but do you think that Xi Jinping will risk an invasion of Taiwan? And if he does, would America defend Taiwan?
Well, I think if you're Taiwanese, you're probably nervous at the prospect of a Donald Trump-Xi Jinping summit coming up. Because, of course, the other thing about the Donald Trump foreign policy is it's very much developed from his lived experience. And, of course, his lived experience is very much about being a property wheeler and dealer. And his view on international relations is, I win, you lose, whereas the diplomats in the audience would know that actually international relations tends to be about I win, you win. So there are some questions, I would have thought, in some minds as to whether or not we're going to see at this summit there being some maybe sotto voce, not spoken loudly, deal between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump over the future, not just of Taiwan, but also of Chinese dominance in the South China Sea. Now, I think it would be very unlikely in the near future for China to mount a military intervention in Taiwan for a number of reasons. First of all, because at the moment it is genuinely ambiguous as to how the US would respond.
Yeah.
And I don't think the Chinese Communist Party would want to risk what that ambiguity might mean. Secondly, I personally don't think that the PLA is ready to mount what is a phenomenally difficult operation. I mean, a very, very difficult operation, which we can go into if you want to. But also, I think, because there's a great degree of instability in the PLA's chain of command at the moment. And the removal of the deputy chairman of the CMC recently, Zhang Yuxia, a man I knew because he was my opposite number, he was a very wise man and a man who genuinely would have spoken truth to power. And suspending people like that and the commander of Eastern Command last week, that will have an impact upon the PLA.
Carter, let me ask you on this. Since you're talking about the PLA, this year, of course, or last year, we've seen Operation Sindoor here in this part of the world, the conflict between India and Pakistan. The PLA was directly involved with satellite imagery and so on with the Pakistanis. There was Chinese equipment that was used in that war. From where you sit as a former head of the British Armed Forces, someone who served in the region in Afghanistan, and now, of course, there is conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan in the last couple of days. What did you make of Operation Sindoor and that military operation and the strategic calculus now between India, China and Pakistan?
I think that it's probably been very useful for China to test some of their military technology with the Pakistanis, and I think the narratives vary. There's been a lot of talk that some of it was quite effective, and I don't know enough of the detail to be sure whether that is the case or not. But I do think it's worth reflecting for a while, given India's strategic position in relation to China, on the extent to which the PLA is an effective and competent military. And if you look back to some of the activity that's going on in the South China Sea, and in particular in what the Filipinos would call the West Philippine Sea, you'll recall that last August there was a collision between a Chinese warship and a Chinese Coast Guard vessel in pursuit of a Philippines Coast Guard vessel. And what was fascinating about that collision is in the 4 hours leading up to it, there was absolutely no radio traffic between the warship and the Coast Guard vessel. So no clear coordination or command and control. And what I think that tells you is that the PLA is a very stovepiped organisation. And I suspect not very capable at integrating land with air, with maritime, with cyber, with space, and all of the other ingredients that modern militaries need to be able to do if they want to conduct joint or multi-domain operations. And I'm sure there are lots of reasons why that's the case. And until the PLA is able to operate in an integrated way, they will not be as effective.
So that's the point. That a number of observers, because we've seen now there are Pakistani officers now deployed in China. Working closely with the PLA. But there is an argument that the NATO operations very well, how integrated in the past European militaries and the Americans have been. There is a view that the Chinese are still some distance away from it, although a lot of help is being in terms of jointness, joint integration, because India faces a two-front threat really, and that's a real threat now for the last year or so. What's your view on that?
The last time they fought a war was in 1979.
Yeah, and I think, Zhang Yuxia, who I talked about a moment ago, he was very proud when he first met me to tell me that he was the only officer in the PLA with combat experience, which he'd earned in their defeat in Vietnam in 1979. And there's no doubt about it. Armies, navies, air forces, they need combat experience. Because until you've actually had that combat experience, it's very difficult to understand how the military instrument should be used, and indeed its limitations. And that is another reason why I think the demise of Zhang Yuxia is sad, because he's somebody who understood how risky combat is and the effect and the nature of war, which we know never really changes. So I think that the PLA will be hungry to get experience. The question, of course, is how they obtain that experience.
So why is Xi sacking so many of his generals? What is the motivation behind these actions?
Well, of course, the narrative is that they're all corrupt and they need to be hounded from power as a result of being corrupt. I think it's probably more complicated than that, and I'm going to speculate, and I would like Mr. Chatham to be sitting over the top of what I'm saying, but I know he's not. I suspect that probably President Xi Jinping, for whatever reason it was, felt slightly threatened by some of these powerful figures.
Can I ask you something about Pakistan? And what's happening in relation to what's happening in the Gulf right now. There are reports that some American aircraft took off from bases in Pakistan for these airstrikes. Of course, there's been a complete shift in the US-Pakistani relationship since Operation Sindoor with Field Marshal Munir pledging all full allegiance to Donald Trump. Pakistan was persona non grata, is now back on the diplomatic table. It's supporting Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, so on and so forth. But Pakistan has also been made part of the deal of Trump's peace board, as it's called. So where do you see Pakistan's strategic positioning right now? Because they're trying to sort of run with the hounds and hunt run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. So where do you see the Pakistani strategic problem for positioning of the military right now?
Well, I think we were all surprised by the closeness of the relationship that appeared to develop between the army chief and President Trump over the last year or so. And I think, to your point about Pakistan's closeness to China, it does look quite contradictory in terms of a relationship. And again, I think one has to examine the motivations behind it. And I don't know the detail, but my guess some of the financial aspects to it are probably helpful from one side or the other, which may well be underpinning what we're seeing going on here. There are probably interests there. I don't know whether Pakistani bases has been used for operations. It may be that that was necessary, given that I don't think Diego Garcia was made available by my own government for this operation in Iran. But I don't know the background, and I suspect it may well be possible. But yes, I think it's an interesting, slightly contradictory position, perhaps, that they find themselves in. And of course, they are now fixed by their so-called declaration of war against Afghanistan. And we well know from many, many years, indeed, hundreds of years of experience with war in Afghanistan, that doesn't always end very well.
What's your view on the Diogo Garcia issue? What's your view of the dispute between the US and the UK on Diogo Garcia?
It's not a dispute between. In essence, the UK government, and to be fair to this government, it was the previous government's decision
Which
as well.
Negotiated them.
Was that the Chagos Islands, which Diego Garcia are a part of, technically and in terms of international law, the Mauritian claim on those islands was stronger than the claim that the British government had. And on that basis, if you are going to respect international law, it was very likely that there would be a claim filed in the International Court of Justice. And under the terms of UN law, that would have led probably to the Mauritians winning the claim. So the UK government's view was that in obeying international law, it would make sense to negotiate a deal with the Mauritian government on the basis of leasing it back over 99 years. Now, going back to the words that I think the Defence Minister used in my very seat here about 45 minutes ago, the answer is, in a world where might is right, you can see why perhaps President Trump took the view that possession is 9/10 of the law rather than leasing it back. So that, I think, is where the issue lies at the moment.
So let me ask you something, since you mentioned about Trump's doctrine of might is right. Now, there is a recalculation happening in Europe for the last year and a half. Because what Trump is doing is he's bringing down or putting the shutters down on the post-World War II order as it was designed, especially the military security architecture, the economic architecture, and all of that. Now a lot of European countries are now rearming. There's a whole thing of imagining a future without the Americans. The British, of course, have had a special relationship with the Americans. Where does that place Britain? And in a America-less security umbrella of Europe, because you've gone on record talking in the past about our armed forces have been hollowed out and the enemy knows it. How do you see India's role in beefing that up? And with the EU-UK agreement or the India-UK agreement, there's a lot of shift around the strategic partnership, around defense cooperation, and so on and so forth. So as you enter this period of flux from a security point of view from Britain, where do you see India within that and your future of the defense of Britain post the Americans?
Gosh, how long have we got? You raise a lot of issues there, and I'll see if I can tick as many off as possible. I think first and foremost, we should be in no doubt that Donald Trump, as I said earlier, was right to call out the other members of NATO, because don't forget it's not just European members of NATO, it includes Canada, for not spending enough on defence. I'm sure that was absolutely right. Second point I'd make is I don't think this means the end of NATO. It's interesting to recognise that the only time that Article 5 of the NATO treaty has ever been tabled was after 9/11, when all the members of NATO went to the help of the United States, and we all got involved in the so-called war against terror thereafter, and lost a lot of lives and spent a lot of treasure doing it. Now, I don't think NATO is dead by any stretch of the imagination. I just think it is being rebalanced in terms of the burden of effort and the burden of sharing within it. Now, what I do think, though, is relevant to all of this are some of the remarks that Prime Minister Mark Carney made at Davos in late January, when he talked about the so-called rules-based system no longer being a thing. And I think, to be realistic, it's probably been in decline ever since 9/11, for all sorts of reasons we don't need to go into now. And I think that the best we can hope for, which in a sense is what he was suggesting, I think, is some form of multilateral liberal order, which I think is something that your country and my country...
And he talked about a concord between the middle powers, which is...
Coming on to middle powers, because of course his definition of middle powers would be those who would subscribe to a multilateral liberal order. One where you don't have to be in one sphere of influence or the other, but if you collaborate and cooperate based upon liberal values, and that means the rights of the individual and the other things that we espouse, then you can actually carve out some form of global commons in which we can all do business together and do it on the basis of it not being transactional, but about it being based upon genuine alliances that are based upon predictability and trust and those sorts of values.
So we are, I think, beginning to run out of time, and there are more conflicts to cover. So the Ukraine war, we've just crossed the 4th anniversary of the Ukraine war. What is the end game there? There have been on-off negotiations between the, between the US and Russia to end the Ukraine conflict. Where do you see this? Where do you see the end game there?
I think it's very difficult to see an obvious end game. I mean, what of course has been striking is that the Trump negotiating position has been very much based upon his lived experience, and I think the same experience of Mr. Witkoff, which is from the property world. This is about a land transaction. Whereas, of course, they're up against somebody in the form of Mr. Putin who sees this as an ideological problem. And those two positions are irreconcilable, to my mind. And that, of course, leads the Ukrainians in a very awkward position being between a rock and a hard place, to all intents and purposes. So to my mind, this war is going to continue. And I don't see a decision quickly, because we've ended up in what a lot of military strategists might call a stalemate, where it has become a war of attrition, and it'll be whichever side collapses slowest but most quickly at the end of it. And I don't see that happening during the course of this calendar year for sure.
General Carter, we've seen two very important speeches by American leaders in the context of Europe in the last couple of months. One is J.D. Vance speaking in Europe on how the Europeans need to rearm for their own defense. And the second one, which was a much more, less direct, more polite argument, but saying the same thing, which was by Secretary of State Rubio, basically talking about Western values, Western civilization, and Europe and America should be coming back together. Now that sort of reminded me a little bit about Samuel Huntington's idea of clash of civilizations, because that's what, it's very specific at the center of the argument that Secretary of State Rubio was making. Where do you think Britain should be in this debate, and where does that leave your special relationship?
Although this is more about a clash within a civilization,
yeah.
in the Vance-Rubio form.
I've always been an advocate of alliances, and I feel very strongly that alliances are essentially the bedrock of stability and security in our world. So that would always be my starting point. I was not an advocate of Brexit, for example. I believed that Britain's future was almost certainly better found inside the European Union, even though the European Union has many problems that need to be resolved. So I think where I would stand on this is that the UK is going to be better if she operates with allies, and I profoundly believe that the relationship, for example, we have with India or other middle powers is going to be the core of a better future for all of us.
So let me ask you a final question. As a global strategist, what would given the state of flux that we are in the international system, what would your advice to India be? How should India play this at the moment?
I think it's entirely right that India has enough political clout and leverage and economic value to be able to be and plough its own furrow, rightly so. And that, of course, is what your Foreign Secretary talks about when he talks about the India way, and I've always agreed with that perspective. I think that this year we will find that India is probably the 4th largest economy in the world. There are many things that need to be resolved, of course, but the reality is that India should have a seat at the global, the great powers table, if you like, whatever that looks like, if it's a Board of Peace or the UN Security Council or whatever. And I think that India should absolutely double down on its democratic values and what it espouses, and it should look for other middle powers that espouse the same values and, in a sense, do what you're doing with France or with Britain or further east, and trade and cooperate and collaborate with those who see the world through the same principles that you've always seen the world through.
Or to ask the same question in a slightly different way, I think there's a statement attributed famously to Deng that in the context of China, obviously, that China should should hide its strength and bide its time, which has obviously changed under Xi. So should India follow the Deng dictum, at least for now?
Sorry, should it
The,
follow?
the Deng dictum, where China should basically keep a low profile and till its times comes in international affairs. A statement attributed to Deng Xiaoping. That China should hide its strength and then bide its time.
Yes, perhaps. I mean, I think that, in this slightly more Hobbesian world that we now occupy, the entry ticket is hard power. So India needs to double down and retain hard power. But it's also about having something to trade. And India's got a lot to trade. When you think of an extraordinarily young and potentially very skilled workforce, that's something to trade. So I think that the opportunities are there for India in a way that they are not for China. If you look at China's challenges, and she has many, her demography is going in absolutely the wrong direction. She has real problems with her domestic economy. Household consumption only represents 35% of her GDP, whereas in India it's between 65 and 70% would be my guess. That's why they have to export so much. I think there are real opportunities for India which you need to double down on.
Right, General Carter, we have totally out of time. Thank you so much for this freewheeling conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for General Nick Carter.